The year is 1936. London buzzes with anticipation. King Edward VIII, the most eligible bachelor in the world, sits on the throne of the British Empire. He's charming, handsome, modern in his thinking. The press adores him. The public sees him as their glamorous king for a new age. But behind the palace walls, a secret is unfolding that will shake the monarchy to its core and change the course of British history forever. This is the story of the Cowboy King and the American woman he loved more than his crown. Welcome to Royal Affairs Unveiled. Today we're diving deep into one of the greatest love stories and constitutional crises of the 20th century. A romance so scandalous that it forced a king to choose between duty and desire, between empire and emotion. This is the story of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. But to understand this romance, we need to go back further to understand the man who would become known as the Cowboy King. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David was born in 1894, the eldest son of the future King George V. As the heir apparent, he was Prince of Wales, destined from birth to wear the crown. But young David, as his family called him, never seemed quite suited for the role destiny had written for him. His father, King George V, was stern, traditional, devoted to duty above all else. He believed the monarchy survived through discipline, dignity, and distance from ordinary people. But David was different. He was restless, modern, desperate to break free from the suffocating protocols of royal life. As a young man, he served briefly in World War I, though he was kept far from the front lines. He chafed at this protective treatment, wanting to share the dangers his generation faced in the trenches. After the war, David became something unprecedented, a celebrity prince. He toured the empire extensively, visiting Canada, Australia, India, Africa, and everywhere he went, crowds went wild for him. He was handsome with his blonde hair and blue eyes. He was charming and seemed genuinely interested in ordinary people. He broke protocol constantly, shaking hands with commoners, visiting slums, expressing concern for the unemployed. The press called him the Prince of Hearts. But it was during his visits to North America that David developed his fascination with all things Western. He loved ranches, cowboys, the wide open spaces. He bought a ranch in Alberta, Canada, and would escape there whenever possible, wearing cowboy boots and casual clothes, riding horses across the prairie. The British establishment was horrified. This wasn't how a future king should behave. But the public loved it. He seemed like one of them, trapped in a gilded cage, desperate for freedom. And there was something else about David that worried the palace: his relationships with women. By the 1920s, it was an open secret among the aristocracy that the Prince of Wales preferred married women. He had a series of affairs, always with sophisticated, worldly women who were already wed to other men. Psychologists have speculated endlessly about why. Was it fear of commitment? Was it a way to rebel against his father? Or was it simply that married women seemed safer, less likely to trap him into a marriage he didn't want? His most serious relationship before Wallis was with Frida Dudley Ward, a married woman he loved for 16 years. But in 1931, that relationship ended. David was approaching 40, still unmarried, still the bachelor prince. His father despaired of him ever producing an heir. The question everyone asked was, who would finally capture the heart of the Prince of Wales? Now, let's turn our attention to the woman who would answer that question. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born in 1896 in Baltimore, Maryland. Unlike David, born into unimaginable privilege, Wallace came from genteel poverty. Her father died when she was young, and her mother struggled to maintain their social position. Wallace learned early that survival meant charm, wit, and marrying well. She was not conventionally beautiful. Her face was angular, her figure boyish by the standards of time. But she had something more valuable than beauty. She had style, confidence, and an ability to make powerful men feel understood. In 1916, she married a U.S. Navy pilot named Earl Winfield Spencer. The marriage was troubled from the start. Spencer drank heavily and became abusive. Wallace left him and eventually divorced him in 1927, something still scandalous in that era. In 1928, she married again, this time to Ernest Simpson, a British-American shipping executive. Through Ernest, Wallis entered London society. The Simpsons moved in wealthy circles, attending parties, making connections. Wallis reinvented herself as a sophisticated hostess, witty and well-dressed, known for her perfect dinner parties and sharp conversation. She was good at reading people, at saying what they wanted to hear. These skills would prove invaluable. The fateful meeting happened in 1931 at a house party. The Prince of Wales was a guest, and Wallis Simpson was introduced to him. According to legend, Wallis greeted him with a bold comment about central heating in American homes versus cold British houses. Instead of being offended by her directness, David was intrigued. Here was a woman who didn't fawn over him, who treated him like an ordinary man. They began seeing each other socially. At first, it seemed innocent enough. The Simpsons were often invited to events where the prince appeared. But gradually something shifted. David became obsessed with Wallis. He showered her with gifts, jewelry, attention. He began telephoning her constantly. He visited the Simpsons' home so frequently that Ernest Simpson must have realized what was happening. What did Wallis see in David? Was it genuine love or calculated ambition? This question has been debated for decades. Wallis's own letters suggest conflicted feelings. She seemed to enjoy the attention, the gifts, the access to royal circles. But she also seemed aware of the danger. She was still married to Ernest, and having an affair with the heir to the throne was playing with fire. By 1934, the relationship was unmistakably romantic. David was completely besotted. He called Wallis by pet names and wrote her love letters that sound almost pathetic in their devotion. He told her she was the only person who understood him, the only one who could make him happy. For a man who'd spent his life surrounded by people telling him how wonderful he was, Wallis offered something different. She challenged him, sometimes mocked him gently, treated him as an equal. He found it intoxicating. But there was a massive problem. Several problems, actually. First, Wallis was married. Second, she was American. Third, she'd been divorced once and was about to be divorced again. And fourth, the Prince of Wales, as future king, was also the future head of the Church of England, which did not recognize divorce and forbade remarriage after divorce. In other words, according to the rules governing the British monarchy, Wallis Simpson was quite literally the worst possible choice for a royal consort. She was everything the establishment feared, a foreign divorcee who threatened the dignity and moral authority of the crown. King George V watched his son's infatuation with growing alarm. He'd always been disappointed in David, but this was catastrophic. In January 1936, the old king lay dying. His last words about his son were reportedly, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." It was a tragically accurate prediction. On January 20th, 1936, King George V died, and David ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. He was 41 years old, the first unmarried man to become king in over a century. The public expected he would now settle down, find a suitable princess, and produce heirs. They had no idea that their new king had already chosen his queen, and she was utterly unacceptable. Edward moved quickly to advance his relationship with Wallis. He invited her on a Mediterranean cruise that summer, along with a group of friends. Photographs of the vacation appeared in American newspapers, the King of England relaxing with a married woman. The British press, following a gentleman's agreement with the palace, printed nothing. But across the Atlantic, the story was spreading. In October 1936, Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson was finalized. The path was now theoretically clear for her to marry Edward. But the constitutional implications were staggering. The king wanted to marry a twice-divorced American woman. It would require the approval of Parliament, the Church, and the governments of all the dominions. That approval would never come. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, met with Edward repeatedly, trying to make him see reason. The king could have mistresses, Baldwin suggested delicately. Many kings had, but marriage was impossible. Edward refused to listen. He insisted that Wallis would be his wife, that the monarchy needed to modernize, that the people would accept her once they got to know her. But Edward was deluding himself. When the British press finally broke its silence in December 1936, public reaction was swift and largely negative. The church was adamantly opposed. The government made clear it would resign rather than approve the marriage. The Dominions, including Canada and Australia, declared they would not accept Wallis as queen. Edward was presented with a choice: give up Wallis and remain king, or abdicate the throne and marry the woman he loved. For the Cowboy King, who'd spent his life chafing against duty and protocol, it wasn't really a choice at all. On December 10th, 1936, less than 11 months after ascending the throne, Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication. The next day, he addressed the nation by radio. His voice crackling over the airwaves, he spoke words that would echo through history. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. It was the first time a British monarch had voluntarily abdicated. Edward's younger brother, Bertie, became King George VI. Bertie was shy, unprepared, and suffered from a severe stammer. He'd never expected or wanted to be king. Edward's decision to follow his heart had thrust an unwilling man onto the throne and changed the line of succession forever. Bertie's daughter, Elizabeth, would eventually become queen. Without Edward's abdication, Elizabeth II would never have reigned. Edward and Wallis married in France in June 1937. It was a small, sad ceremony. No members of Edward's family attended. He was given the title Duke of Windsor, but Wallis was denied the style of Royal Highness, a deliberate snub that Edward never forgave. The couple settled into a life of wealthy exile, moving between Paris and the south of France, entertaining society friends, living off Edward's considerable fortune. But was it the great romance Edward had proclaimed? The evidence is mixed. Wallis's letters to her friends suggest she'd never really wanted to marry Edward, that she'd been carried along by his obsession. She'd expected to remain his mistress while married to Ernest, enjoying the benefits without the consequences. The abdication had trapped her just as surely as it had freed Edward. There were ugly rumors, too. Stories that Wallis had other lovers even during her relationship with Edward. Whispers about her past in China during her first marriage, about affairs and scandals. Whether these stories were true or merely character assassination by those who hated her is still debated. The darkest chapter came during World War II. Edward and Wallis visited Nazi Germany in 1937, meeting with Adolf Hitler. Edward made statements sympathetic to the Nazi regime, suggesting Britain should seek peace with Germany. When war broke out in 1939, Winston Churchill worried that Edward might be used by the Nazis for propaganda purposes. He arranged for Edward to be appointed governor of the Bahamas, essentially exiling him to a colonial backwater for the duration of the war. Declassified documents have since revealed that the Nazis did have plans involving Edward. They hoped that if Britain fell, they could install him as a puppet king with Wallis as his queen. Whether Edward would have cooperated is unknown, but the fact that the Nazis considered him sympathetic tells you something about his judgment and character. After the war, Edward and Wallis returned to France. They lived a glittering but ultimately empty life, hosting parties, traveling, shopping. Edward had no purpose, no role. The man who'd been born to be king spent 35 years in exile, increasingly bitter and isolated from his family. He and Wallis were rarely invited to Britain, and when they were, it was under strict protocols that emphasized their outsider status. Wallis, for her part, became obsessed with fashion and jewelry. She wore the fabulous pieces Edward had given her over the years, diamonds and emeralds and sapphires that once symbolized his love, but now seemed more like compensation for all she'd given up. Because Wallis had given up quite a bit too. She'd become the most hated woman in Britain, blamed for stealing a king and weakening the monarchy. She could never go home to America without facing hostile press. She was trapped in a golden cage, married to a man who increasingly seemed lost and pathetic. Edward died in 1972 at age 77. His brother, King George VI, had died 20 years earlier, worn down by the stress of a kingship he'd never wanted. Elizabeth II, Edward's niece, had reigned for 2 decades. Wallis attended Edward's funeral in Britain. Frail and elderly, finally granted the royal treatment she'd been denied in life. She lived another 14 years, increasingly senile, cared for by servants, dying in Paris in 1986 at age 89. So what's the legacy of the Cowboy King and his hidden romance? It's complicated, like all great love stories. On one hand, it's genuinely romantic. A king gave up the most powerful throne in the world for the woman he loved. He chose personal happiness over duty, emotion over obligation. In an age of arranged royal marriages, that was radical and moving. But on the other hand, it's a story of selfishness and delusion. Edward abandoned his duty when his country and empire needed leadership. He placed his personal desires above the institution he'd been born to serve. His brother paid the price, dying young from the stress. His niece was thrust into a role she'd never expected. And for what? A relationship that seems to have brought neither Edward nor Wallis lasting happiness. The romance also revealed the monarchy's vulnerability. Edward's abdication showed that the crown could not control its own members, that even kings were human with human weaknesses. It forced the royal family to modernize, to accept that duty and tradition alone weren't enough. They needed to appear relatable while maintaining dignity, human while remaining royal. For Wallis, history has been harsh. She's often portrayed as a calculating woman who seduced a weak king for power and jewels. More sympathetic interpretations suggest she was a victim of circumstance, a woman who'd been seeking security and ended up trapped by a king's obsession. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that this romance changed history. Without Edward's abdication, there would be no Queen Elizabeth II, beloved by millions, who reigned for 70 years and defined modern monarchy. Elizabeth learned from her uncle's failure. She understood that being sacrifice, that duty came before desire, that the crown was bigger than any individual. The Cowboy King's hidden romance wasn't really hidden at all. It played out on the world stage, in newspapers and radio broadcasts, in parliamentary debates, and church sermons. It captivated millions who saw it as romantic, tragic, scandalous, or all three at once. And it asks us questions that still resonate today. Should people in positions of power be allowed to follow their hearts, even when it conflicts with their duties? Can institutions like monarchy survive if they're too rigid about personal choices? What do we owe to tradition versus what we owe to ourselves? These questions don't have easy answers. Edward and Wallis are buried together in the royal burial ground at Windsor, finally accepted in death, if never quite in life. Their love story is commemorated in movies, books, and documentaries like this one. Some see them as heroes who chose love over convention. Others see them as cautionary tales about the dangers of selfishness and poor judgment. Perhaps the real lesson is that even kings are human, capable of both great love and great foolishness. Edward VIII, the Cowboy King, was born to rule an empire but found he couldn't rule his own heart. Whether that makes him romantic or irresponsible, heroic or selfish, is something each of us must decide for ourselves. Thank you for joining us on Royal Affairs Unveiled. The story of Edward and Wallis reminds us that behind every crown, beneath every royal title, beat hearts that long for love, acceptance, and happiness, just like the rest of us. Sometimes that search for happiness changes history itself. Until next time, keep unveiling the hidden stories behind the royal facade.